Hi everyone, my name is Reza. On behalf of my collaborators and myself, I will present our paper entitled Kernel Normalized Convolutional Networks, which has been accepted at TMLR. Convolutional neural networks are highly popular in image vision tasks such as image classification and semantic segmentation. One of the main building blocks of CNNs is the normalization layer. There are different normalization layers such as batch norm, layer norm, and group norm in the literature. Assuming two-dimensional images, our input is a four-dimensional tensor with batch, channel, height, and width as dimensions. Different normalization layers employ different dimensions during normalization. For example, batch norm employs the batch, height, and width dimensions for normalization. Layer norm, on the other hand, considers the channel, height, and width dimensions for normalization. As you might notice, batch norm is the only normalization layer that employs the batch dimension for normalization. So we say batch norm is not a batch-independent layer. The other normalization layers, on the other hand, are batch-independent. Batch norm, layer norm, instance norm, and group norm consider all elements in the height and width dimensions during normalization. So they are global normalization layers. Positional norm and local context norm, on the other hand, consider a subset of elements from the height and width dimensions during normalization. So they are local normalization layers. In spite of their differences, the existing normalization layers have at least one thing in common. There is a one-to-one correspondence between the original input elements and normalized elements. That is, the existing normalization layers do not change the shape of the input tensor. Batch norm is the most popular normalization layer for CNNs. Batch norm, however, has several limitations. First of all, batch norm breaks the independence among the samples in the batch. Why? Because it employs the batch dimension during normalization. Consequently, batch norm does not perform well with small batch sizes, and batch norm is not applicable to differentially private learning. As mentioned before, there are batch-independent alternatives such as layer norm and group norm, which perform normalization separately for each sample in the batch. However, these normalization layers are not competitive to batch norm in non-private learning, especially in image classification and semantic segmentation. Moreover, their performance is not as expected in differentially private learning. This motivates us to design a new normalization layer, which is batch independent, but more efficient in both non-private and differentially private learning. In this paper, we propose the kernel normalization kernel norm layer. Kernel norm is similar to a pooling layer, except that kernel norm normalizes the elements specified by the kernel window instead of computing the average or maximum of the elements. And kernel norm operates over all channels instead of a single channel. In the figure, for example, we have a kernel norm layer with kernel size of 4, a stride of 3, and padding of 0. Kernel norm normalizes all elements in the channel dimension and 4 times 4 elements specified by the kernel size from the height and width dimensions. Next, it slides the window 3 elements to the right, because the stride is 3, and repeats the normalization process over the new region. As you can see, unlike the existing normalization layers, there is no one-to-one correspondence between the original input elements and the output elements in kernel norm. In other words, in kernel norm, we have overlapping normalization units, the dashed hatched area, and some elements, uncolored ones, are ignored during normalization. Given that the output tensor and the input tensor might have different shapes in kernel norm. Kernel norm is a batch-independent layer. Why? Because it does not consider the batch dimension during normalization. In other words, kernel norm performs normalization separately for each sample in the batch. Moreover, kernel norm is a local normalization layer because kernel norm considers a subset of elements from the height and width dimensions specified by the kernel window during normalization. Formally, kernel norm takes kernel size, stride, padding, dropout probability, and epsilon as arguments. In the first step, it creates the normalization units using kernel size, stride, and padding values. Normalization unit is a group of input elements that are normalized together. In the figure, for example, we have two normalization units highlighted by blue and green. Note that there is an overlap between the normalization units, the dash hatched area. Each normalization unit contains all 6 elements from the channel dimension, 4 elements from the height dimension, and 4 elements from the width dimension, because the kernel size is 4 times 4. After that, for each normalization unit, kernel norm applies dropout with probability p to the original unit to obtain the dropped out unit u prime. Next, it computes the average and variance of the elements in the dropped out unit. Afterwards, kernel norm normalizes the elements of the original unit with the mean and variance of the dropped out unit to obtain the normalized unit. At the end, kernel norm concatenates the normalized units to obtain the final output tensor. One of the defining characteristics of kernel norm is to extensively benefit from the spatial correlation among the elements during normalization, thanks to the overlapping normalization units. Moreover, kernel norm introduces a regularizing effect during normalization by employing randomized mean and variance values. We also propose the kernel normalized convolutional layer KNCon, which is the combination of the kernel norm and convolutional layers. KNCon first applies kernel norm to the input tensor to obtain the normalized tensor. Next, it feeds the normalized tensor as input to the convolutional layer. Note that the kernel size and stride of the convolutional layer are identical to the kernel size of kernel norm in the figure 3 times 3. From another perspective, we can say KNCon is the same as the convolutional layer, except that KNCon first normalizes the elements specified by the kernel window and then computes the convolution using the normalized tensor and kernel weights. In both forms, KNCon is computationally expensive Why? Because we have overlapping normalization units, and consequently, K-conv leads to a large number of normalization units, and normalizing those units incurs remarkable computational overhead. To address this problem, we propose the computationally efficient K-conv layer by reformulating the original formula of K-conv. More precisely, this version of K-conv first computes the convolution using the original tensor and kernel weights. Next, it adjusts the output of the convolution using the mean and variance of the dropped out unit. This way, we completely eliminate the overhead of normalizing the elements and improve the computational efficiency by orders of magnitude. Here is the algorithm for the computationally efficient K-conv layer. We incorporate the proposed layers into Kernel Normalized Convolutional Networks K-conv nets. More precisely, K-conv nets are bespoke architectures for kernel normalization. They employ the kernel norm and K-conv layers as the main building blocks. They are free of the batch norm layers, and they employ kernel sizes other than 1 times 1 to take advantage of the spatial correlation among the elements during normalization. As an example of K-conv nets, we propose kernel normalized residual networks, KNRes nets. KNRes nets employ 3 types of blocks: the basic block, the bottleneck block, and the transitional block. KNResNet 18 and 34 are based on basic blocks, while KNResNet 50 is based on the bottleneck block. All KNRes nets employ transitional blocks to increase the number of filters and to downsample the input tensor. Here are the architectures for KNResNet 18, KNResNet 34, and KNResNet 50. We make performance comparison between KNRes nets and the competitors. We divide the evaluations into 4 categories: batch size dependent performance analysis on CIFAR 100, image classification on ImageNet, semantic segmentation on Citoscapes, and differentially private image classification on the downsampled version of ImageNet. Batch size dependent performance analysis. According to the table, with batch size of 2, KNRes nets significantly outperform batch normalized res nets. With batch size of 32 and 256, KNRes nets are highly competitive to batch norm-based res nets. And for all considered batch sizes, KNRes nets considerably outperform layer normalized and group normalized res nets. Image classification. As shown in the table, KNRes nets are highly competitive to batch normalized res nets in image classification on ImageNet. Moreover, KNRes nets outperform layer normalized and group normalized res nets on ImageNet. Semantic segmentation on Citoscapes. KNRes nets are highly competitive to batch norm-based res nets in semantic segmentation on Citoscapes. Moreover, KNRes nets considerably outperform layer norm, group norm, and local context norm-based res nets in semantic segmentation. Differentially private image classification. According to the table, KNResNet 18 significantly outperform layer normalized and group normalized ResNet 18 in differentially private image classification on the downsampled version of ImageNet. Convergence rate. As shown in the figure, with batch size of 2, KN-ResNet 50 converges considerably faster than the competitors. Moreover, in differentially private learning, KN-ResNet 18 provides significantly higher convergence rate than layer normalized and group normalized ResNet 18. On ImageNet, KN-ResNet 34 and KN-ResNet 50 converge slightly faster than the batch normalized counterparts. Moreover, KN-ResNet 34 and 50 provide significantly higher convergence rate than layer normalized and group normalized competitors. In addition to ResNets, we evaluate the performance of kernel norm on the convex architecture, which employs layer norm as the underlying normalization layer. According to our results, kernel normalized convex tiny outperforms the layer normalized counterpart. These results indicate that kernel norm is also an efficient normalization layer for the convex architecture. We perform an ablation study using KN-ResNet 50 and the CFAR 100 dataset. Based on our results, normalization using kernel norm provides accuracy gain of around 7%, and the regularizing effect of dropout provides additional accuracy gain of around 2%. Normalizing the feature values using the mean and standard deviation of the dataset is a common data preprocessing step for batch, layer, and group normalized models. This is unnecessary for kernel normalized models because all KN-conv layers, including the first one, are self-normalizing. That is, they normalize the input tensor first and then compute the convolution. We also visualize the loss landscape using KN-ResNet 18 and the competitors on the CFAR 10 dataset. As shown in the figures, KN-ResNet 18 provides a flatter loss landscape than batch, group, and layer normalized ResNet 18. We make a comparison between KN-ResNets and batch normalized ResNets from the computational efficiency perspective. According to the table, our largest model, KN-ResNet 50, is slower than batch normalized ResNet 50 by factor of around 3. Note that kernel norm and KN-conv have been implemented using PyTorch primitives, but batch norm's implementation is in CUDA. In the future, we can implement kernel norm and KN-conv in CUDA and considerably improve the computational efficiency of KN-ResNets. In terms of memory usage, KN-ResNet 50 consumes higher memory than batch normalized ResNet 50 by factor of around 2.5. Again, in the future, we can significantly improve the memory usage of KN-ResNets by implementing the underlying kernel norm and KN-conv layers in CUDA. In summary, we propose kernel norm and KN-conv as batch-independent layers, which can extensively benefit from the spatial correlation among the elements during normalization, thanks to their overlapping normalization units. We also proposed kernel normalized residual networks, KN-ResNets, which employ kernel norm and KN-conv as their main building blocks and are free of the batch norm layers. Through extensive experiments in image classification, semantic segmentation, and differentially private learning tasks, we showed that KN-ResNets considerably outperform or are highly competitive to batch norm-based counterparts. Moreover, KN-ResNets provide significantly higher performance than layer norm and group norm based ResNets in almost all cases. Given our results, we can say kernel norm combines the performance advantage of batch norm with the batch independence benefit of layer norm and group norm. Thank you very much for your attention. If you have any question, please contact me through email. The code of our paper is publicly available in the NormTorch repository at GitHub.